January 28th, 1977, 3:47 in the afternoon, Metropolitan Correctional Center, Manhattan. Frank Lucas sits across a metal table from two federal prosecutors, a yellow legal pad in front of him. 100 names. That's what he'd written in his cramped handwriting over the past 6 hours. 100 names of cops, dealers, politicians, and killers. Names that would shatter the largest narcotics network the East Coast had ever seen. Names that would put bullets in 3 different people before the month was over. Lucas slides the pad across the table. Detective Jorge Ramirez, 23 years on the force, receives a carbon copy of that list at 11:15 in the morning, 3 days later. By 6:42 that same evening, Jorge Ramirez is dead. His body would be found slumped over the steering wheel of his unmarked Dodge. 2 bullets behind the left ear, parked 3 blocks from the 32nd precinct. The list was still in his jacket pocket. This is the story nobody tells about Frank Lucas. Not the heroin, not the coffins, not the money. This is about what happens when a king becomes an informant. 14 months earlier, December 6th, 1975, 535 Livingston Street, Teaneck, New Jersey. A sprawling $325,000 Tudor-style home in the suburbs. White shutters, manicured lawn, a swimming pool in the back that Frank Lucas's mother called too big for any Christian home. At 6:15 in the morning, 70 DEA agents and NYPD detectives descended on that property with a federal search warrant. Frank Lucas was sitting in his kitchen eating scrambled eggs when they kicked in the door. They found $584,000 in cash hidden behind a false wall in the basement. Another $275,000 was buried in metal boxes in the backyard. They seized 3 luxury vehicles, 14 fur coats, and enough documentation to trace $250 million in heroin distribution across 17 states. Frank didn't run, he didn't resist. He set down his fork, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and looked up at the lead agent. "What took you so long?" he said. Those 4 words would echo through every subsequent interrogation. Because Frank Lucas knew something that morning that the feds didn't. He knew he was going to walk. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but Frank Lucas had an insurance policy that no federal prosecutor could touch. He had names. To understand why 100 names could kill a detective, you have to understand who Frank Lucas was before he became famous. He was born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina. By age 15, he'd already hustled his way through half the state, running numbers and small-time scams. But Lucas was different from the hustlers around him. He watched, he studied. He took notes in a small composition book that he kept tucked in his jacket pocket. In 1946, at 16 years old, he arrived in Harlem with $88 to his name. By 1952, he'd caught the attention of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful black gangster in New York City. Lucas became Bumpy's driver, his enforcer, his shadow. For 15 years, he absorbed everything the old man taught him about power, loyalty, and the application of controlled violence. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on July 7th, 1968, Frank Lucas didn't mourn. He moved. Within 72 hours, Lucas had contacted a former Army serviceman with connections in Bangkok. He flew to Thailand within the month, and there, in a jungle processing facility 90 miles north of the Shan States, he discovered something that would change everything. Pure heroin, uncut, 98% pure. Street heroin in Harlem, at the time, averaged 3 to 5% purity. By the time the Italian mob cut and recut their product through multiple middlemen, users were injecting mostly filler. But what nobody knew was that Frank Lucas had eliminated every middleman. Here's where it gets interesting. Lucas negotiated directly with a Chinese Thai supplier named Luechi Rubiwat, paying $4,200 per kilogram. That same kilogram, after cutting, would yield $300,000 on Harlem streets. His profit margin exceeded 7,000%. He called his product Blue Magic for the blue tape on each package. The military transports that brought heroin into the United States remain the most controversial aspect of Lucas's operation. He later claimed in multiple interviews that he smuggled drugs in the coffins of dead American servicemen returning from Vietnam, a claim hotly disputed by military historians, but never definitively disproven. What is documented? Between 1968 and 1975, Frank Lucas personally oversaw the importation of approximately $250 million in heroin, and he kept meticulous records, every transaction, every payment, every name. At exactly 4:15 in the afternoon on March 3rd, 1972, everything changed for the New York Police Department. Frank Lucas walked into Knapp Commission hearings, not as a witness, but as a spectator. He sat in the back row wearing a $12,000 vicuña coat and watched as officer after officer testified about systemic corruption in the NYPD. Lucas later told associates he wasn't there to watch, he was there to shop. By that evening, he had approached 3 officers mentioned in the testimony. Within a month, all 3 were on his payroll. By 1974, Lucas was paying $280,000 annually in police protection to officers ranging from beat cops to at least 1 deputy inspector. This is where Frank Lucas's genius showed. He didn't just pay cops to look away. He turned them into active participants. Officers would tip him off to raids. They would arrest his competitors. They would provide security for his counting houses. And every single one of them signed the book. Not literally. Lucas wasn't that obvious. But he documented every payment in a coded ledger that he kept in a safe deposit box at Chase Manhattan Bank 115th Street branch. When federal prosecutors finally cracked that code in late 1976, they found 143 names: police officers, customs officials, 2 assistant district attorneys, a city councilman, and at least 12 members of the Italian Mafia who had been cutting deals with Lucas behind their bosses' backs. That list was a death warrant waiting to be signed, but we'll get to that. First, you need to understand the Ramirez angle. Detective Jorge Ramirez joined the NYPD in 1954, 3 years after his family immigrated from Puerto Rico. He worked his way up through vice, then homicide, then narcotics. By 1970, he was assigned to the Joint Task Force on Organized Crime, working directly with federal agents to build cases against major drug networks. Ramirez had been investigating Frank Lucas since 1969. He had a cardboard box in his home office, manila folders stuffed with photographs, surveillance logs, and interview transcripts. His wife, Maria, would later tell investigators that Jorge spent more time with that box than with his own children. He was obsessed, she said. He said Frank was smarter than anyone the department had ever seen. He said taking him down would be the case of a lifetime. But here's what nobody knew at the time. Jorge Ramirez's name was also in Frank Lucas's ledger. The relationship between Lucas and Ramirez was complicated in ways that don't fit neatly into categories of good and evil. According to documents that surfaced in a 2002 civil lawsuit, Ramirez had accepted exactly 1 payment from Lucas's organization, $4,500, delivered in a brown envelope in November 1971. The payment was allegedly in exchange for the name of an informant who had been feeding information to a competing investigation. Whether Ramirez actually provided that name is unclear. What is documented? That informant, a street dealer named Curtis Little Dip Morrison, was found shot to death in Marcus Garvey Park 6 days later. Ramirez had 3 choices after that. First, he could report the payment and the possible connection to Morrison's death, ending his career and likely facing criminal charges himself. Second, he could continue investigating Lucas while burying his own involvement, hoping the connection would never surface. Third, he could fully commit, take more payments, become part of the machine, and accept the protection that came with being in Lucas's pocket. He chose the second option. For 5 years, Detective Jorge Ramirez continued building his case against Frank Lucas while living with the knowledge that his own name existed somewhere in Lucas's records. He had been planning for years how to deal with this if it ever came out. What he couldn't plan for was what happened when Lucas decided to talk. January 1977. Frank Lucas was facing a 40-year federal sentence for drug trafficking and related charges. His empire had been dismantled, his bank accounts frozen, his family scattered. But Frank still had leverage. Richie Roberts, the lead prosecutor on the case, had built his career on bringing down Lucas. He was meticulous, incorruptible, and according to Lucas himself, the only honest man in the whole damn city. Roberts approached Lucas with a deal: full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence and witness protection. Lucas had a counteroffer. "I'll give you everyone," he said. "Everyone who ever took a dime from me. Every cop, every agent, every politician. You want the whole system? I'll give you the whole system." He paused. "But I walk in 15 years, not a day more." Roberts balked. 40 years reduced to 15? For a man who had flooded American cities with heroin, destroyed thousands of lives, and likely ordered multiple murders? It was obscene. But Roberts also understood something crucial about institutional power. Frank Lucas wasn't just a drug dealer. He was a walking exposé. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. His testimony could trigger the largest corruption prosecution in NYPD history. On January 28th, 1977, the deal was finalized. Frank Lucas sat down with a legal pad and began to write. He had 72 hours to complete his initial disclosure. That was the agreement. 72 hours of uninterrupted testimony, recorded on reel-to-reel tape, with federal stenographers documenting every word. Lucas began with the street-level operators, runners, distributors, enforcers, men who had killed on his orders, men who had died on his orders. He named dates, locations, amounts. By hour 18, he moved up the chain. Suppliers, money launderers, the bankers who had processed his cash through offshore accounts in the Bahamas and Switzerland. By hour 36, he reached the police. This is where the room went silent. Lucas named officers from 12 different precincts. He provided dates of payments. He described the system of dead drops, coded phone calls, and intermediary contacts that had kept the relationship clean. The FBI agent in the room, Senior Special Agent William Tanner, would later describe it as watching a man detonate his own life and everyone else's at the same time. By hour 54, Lucas had named politicians, lawyers, judges, and Detective Jorge Ramirez. The list was supposed to be sealed. Federal prosecutors implemented strict protocols. Only 6 people had access to the full document. It was stored in a secured file room at the U.S. Attorney's Office on Street Andrews Plaza. But information like this doesn't stay contained. By February 1st, 4 days after Lucas finished writing, at least 3 different parties had obtained partial copies of the list. The first leak came from inside the prosecutor's office itself. A junior assistant, later identified as Malcolm Green, had photographed 17 pages of the disclosure and sold them to an intermediary for $8,000. The second leak came from the NYPD, where a summary of police names had been circulated to Internal Affairs for pre-investigation review. Someone in that department talked. The third leak is still officially unconfirmed, but multiple sources indicate that representatives of the Gambino crime family had obtained names through their own contacts within law enforcement. The FBI was closing in on the leakers. NYPD Internal Affairs was scrambling to contain the fallout. And somewhere in Harlem, people who had trusted Frank Lucas their whole lives were suddenly realizing their names were on a piece of paper that could send them to prison for decades. Detective Jorge Ramirez received his copy of the list at 11:15 in the morning on January 31st, 1977, 72 hours and 43 minutes after Frank Lucas signed his cooperation agreement. He recognized 19 names on that list. One of them was his own. What nobody knew was that Jorge Ramirez wasn't the only person with a copy of the list that morning. Nicky Barnes, the so-called Mr. Untouchable, who ran a competing heroin network, had obtained a summary through his own sources by January 30th. Barnes was furious. Not because his name was on the list, it wasn't, but because 3 of his key lieutenants were named as having sold information to Lucas's organization over the years. Barnes ordered an immediate purge. Within 72 hours, 2 of those lieutenants had disappeared. The 3rd fled to Miami and was never heard from again. Italian mob contacts were similarly alarmed. Frank Lucas had documented at least 4 different occasions where members of the Lucchese family had approached him about joint ventures. These meetings violated standing orders from the commission, which had explicitly forbidden cooperation with black drug traffickers. Anthony "Fat" Tony Salerno, acting boss of the Genovese family, reportedly received news of Lucas's cooperation within hours. According to later FBI surveillance transcripts, Salerno's response was succinct. Find out what he said. Find out who's exposed. Handle it. But here's where the real danger emerged. The police officers on Lucas's list didn't just fear prison, they feared each other. Corrupt networks depend on mutual silence. Every officer who took money from Lucas was protected by the knowledge that exposing him meant exposing themselves. But once Lucas started talking, that protection collapsed. Suddenly, every name on that list was asking the same question: who else is going to flip? Who's going to try to make their own deal? Who's going to eliminate the competition first? Detective Jorge Ramirez understood this calculation better than anyone. He knew his name was on the list. He knew that other officers would be terrified of what he might know about them. And he knew that the safest course of action from their perspective was to make sure Jorge Ramirez never had a chance to talk. January 31st, 1977, 6:17 in the evening. Detective Jorge Ramirez left the 32nd precinct through the rear entrance. He told his partner, Danny Sullivan, that he was going home early. Maria was making arroz con pollo. The kids had a school recital. Normal evening, normal life. The last time anyone saw Jorge Ramirez alive was in the precinct parking lot, unlocking his unmarked Dodge Coronet. At 6:42 in the evening, a sanitation worker named Horace Bell discovered the car parked at an odd angle on West 149th Street, 3 blocks from the precinct. The engine was running. The driver's door was slightly ajar. Bell approached the vehicle and saw Detective Ramirez slumped over the steering wheel. He ran to a payphone and called 911. The first responders arrived at 6:54 in the evening. They found no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no witnesses. The 2 bullets behind the left ear suggested professional work. Close range, small caliber, sound suppressed. The list was still in his jacket pocket. 23 pages of names, including his own, folded neatly in a manila envelope. Whoever killed Jorge Ramirez either didn't know about the list, didn't care about the list, or wanted it to be found. The sound of the evidence bag sealing was the beginning of a case that would never be officially solved. The room went silent in the prosecutor's office when news arrived. Frank Lucas, still in custody, received word of the killing within the hour. According to guards present, he didn't react visibly. He simply nodded in return to his legal documents. But internally, Lucas understood exactly what had happened. His list wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a catalyst. Every name on those pages was now a potential target. Every dirty cop, every compromised politician, every mob associate suddenly had a reason to fear for their lives and a reason to kill to protect themselves. Within the next 6 weeks, 2 more people connected to Lucas's disclosures will be found dead under suspicious circumstances. A low-level customs official named Walter Grisby disappeared on February 14th. His body was discovered in the Bronx River a month later. A former money courier named Denise Watkins was killed in what police classified as a robbery gone wrong on February 23rd. Neither case was ever solved. Neither case was ever officially connected to the Lucas investigation, but federal prosecutors knew. The FBI knew. The NYPD brass knew. Frank Lucas had opened a door, and the violence that came through it couldn't be contained. The ripple effect was immediate. Within 90 days of Lucas's cooperation agreement, 47 people had been indicted on charges ranging from bribery to narcotics trafficking to murder. 14 NYPD officers were suspended pending investigation. 3 resigned before charges could be filed. The Knapp Commission, which had exposed police corruption 5 years earlier, suddenly seemed like a preview of something much larger. But here's the part that stayed buried. Internal NYPD documents, declassified in 2008, reveal that the department conducted its own shadow investigation into the Ramirez killing. The investigation was led by Deputy Chief Thomas Connolly, a 30-year veteran with no apparent connection to Lucas or his network. Connolly's team identified 3 potential suspects, all of them police officers whose names appeared on Lucas's list. All 3 had unverified alibis for the time of the killing. All 3 retired within 18 months of Ramirez's death. No charges were ever filed. The investigation was officially closed in 1982 with a finding of insufficient evidence. Detective Jorge Ramirez's name was never formally cleared in the corruption allegations. His family received his pension, but his reputation remained ambiguous. A man who might have been corrupt, might have been trying to make it right, and was killed before anyone could determine the truth. Frank Lucas served 11 years in federal custody. He was released in 1991, rearrested in 1994 on drug charges involving an attempt to exchange heroin for a kilogram of cocaine, and served an additional 7 years. He died on May 30th, 2019, at the age of 88, in his home in New Jersey. The legacy he left behind was complicated in ways that don't reduce to simple morality. Lucas destabilized one of the most powerful drug networks in American history, both through his own criminal enterprise and through his decision to dismantle it from the inside. His cooperation led to more than 100 convictions, including numerous corrupt officials who might otherwise have operated for decades. But the human cost of that cooperation was devastating. At least 3 deaths can be credibly connected to the panic his disclosures created. Dozens of lives were destroyed by association. Families of those named, colleagues of those arrested, communities that had relied on the distorted economy Lucas's operation had created. And Detective Jorge Ramirez, a man who may have taken a single bribe in a moment of weakness and spent the rest of his career trying to outrun that decision. He paid the ultimate price. The strategic lesson extracted from the Lucas cooperation is still taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico. It's called the cascade effect. When a major criminal figure decides to cooperate, the first 48 hours are the most dangerous. Everyone connected to that figure must immediately calculate their own exposure, their own vulnerability, and their own options. For some, the calculation leads to surrender. They cooperate themselves, hoping to secure their own deals. For others, the calculation leads to flight. They disappear before anyone can find them. But for a small, dangerous minority, the calculation leads to violence. They decide that the only way to protect themselves is to eliminate the people who could testify against them, starting with the ones who seem most likely to flip. Jorge Ramirez fit that profile, a cop with a single documented payment, facing pressure from multiple directions, with enough knowledge of the system to be dangerous if he decided to talk. Someone, and the FBI has never determined who, decided that Jorge Ramirez couldn't be allowed to face that choice. 3 days after Frank Lucas wrote 100 names on a legal pad, a 23-year veteran of the NYPD was dead. The system protected itself. It always does. What nobody knew until decades later was that Jorge Ramirez had prepared for this possibility. In 2003, during the settlement of Maria Ramirez's estate, her children discovered a safety deposit box at a Chase Bank in the Bronx. Inside was a single cassette tape, recorded in 1975, and a handwritten letter explaining its contents. On that tape, Jorge Ramirez described in detail the circumstances of the $4,500 payment he had accepted. He named the intermediary who had approached him. He documented what he had and had not provided in return. And he named the 3 officers he believed were most deeply involved in Frank Lucas's protection network. All 3 of those officers were dead by 2003. 2 from natural causes, 1 in a 1988 car accident that was never investigated as suspicious. The tape was turned over to the FBI in 2004. The case was officially reopened and reclosed within 6 months. To this day, no one has ever been charged with the murder of Detective Jorge Ramirez. The official file remains open, classified as an unsolved homicide, gathering dust in a Manhattan warehouse, somewhere alongside thousands of other cases from a city that has learned to forget its inconvenient dead. Frank Lucas took 100 names to his grave. Jorge Ramirez took his truth to his... And somewhere in that space between cooperation and silence, between crime and justice, between the powerful and the expendable, the real story of what happened in January 1977 waits for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finally tell it. Subscribe for more untold stories of power, betrayal, and the hidden history of American crime. Leave a comment. When does cooperation become betrayal? And when does silence become complicity? What would you have done in Jorge Ramirez's position?